Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Welcome to Northern Lights. I'm Emilie Buchwald, the publisher at Milkweed Editions. We're here in the Milkweed office at the Open Book Literary Center, and we have the pleasure of talking with Carol Bly about her work. There are a number of wonderful books here that Carol has written, some of which we've had the pleasure of publishing, and we've been chatting a little about the background of the work and the fact that Carol's writing actually goes back to a true confession from the early 50s. She has confessed to the True Confession.
That's right. True Confessions was my first publication. And after writing insincere ones for a number of months in New York, I decided to write a sincere one. And so they asked for an essay on the subject of whether the Vietnam vet whose wife had run out on him while he was gone should trust her and try once again. And I wrote in, it was a contest, with others and said, nope, I wouldn't do it. I think we're looking at a piece of trash here, and you should just give it up. And I won.
It's a wonderful beginning. And it's been truthfulness ever since in everything that you've written. I've commented on the fact that you've written nonfiction, short stories, wonderful books about your ethical ideas, and they all are marvelously focused, and each of them is individual as your fingerprint. And so I'd like to talk about the fact that you began with Letters from the Country. What actually prompted you to begin writing Letters from the Country?
That Letters from the Country was a series of monthly essays for Minnesota Public Radio magazine. Patricia Hampel asked me to try that, and so I did, starting in 1973 or so, I think. And then at the end of it, I had no idea of its being a book, but at the end of it, an editor at Harper asked me if I had any more when he saw one. And I said, oh yes, there are 31 of them in all or so. And he said, oh, well then, we'd like to look at those. And then 2 weeks later, he called and said, we'd like to do a book. So that was it.
It's nice when an editor has a good idea as a result of seeing good work. Milkweed had the pleasure of first publishing Carol Bly in Milkweed Chronicle, the journal that of literature and visual art.
Well, let me interrupt you and ask you, when were the years of Milkweed Chronicle?
We began in 1980 and we published through 1987. And then we began publishing books in 84. And Backbone, your collection of short fiction, was our first collection of short stories. And we were so thrilled to have published them. And then to find out that the rest of the world thought they were as good as we did. And these grew out of, again, your life in western Minnesota.
Yes, they were mostly, I believe all of the stories in there were set in that kind of a setting, you know, among prairie people, shy people, so to speak, not in the habit of expressing themselves loudly, but having lots and lots of strong feelings to express, and lots of experience, hands-on experience, which always fascinated me.
Yes, and that comes across, that hands-on experience. And it's the same background in The Tomcat's Wife, your second collection of short stories.
Yes, that's right. That's those are also, most of those stories are set in a town very much like either towns around Duluth, where I was born, or the town of Madison, Minnesota. And so if they have prairie grasses in them and soybeans and corn, then they're from western Minnesota, and otherwise they're from the north.
I see. I hadn't realized that. And what made you decide then that you wanted to write about the art and the craft of creating fiction?
I began to teach as a result of having those two books out, Letters from the Country and Backbone. I began to teach writing at Hamlin, and I began to see that people were asking writers to learn in very strange ways. That is, they're asking them to learn in groups of peers who would then look at each other's work and comment on it. And I realized that wasn't working at all, and that what worked was for the writers to know that the teacher would read the writing that they did and would make a comment on it. So a grown-up human being in a mentor position needed to make a comment. And I stopped eventually allowing people to look at each other's work. And then I thought, that's a theory. That's a theory of pedagogy. And so then I got interested in how we teach people how to write. The other thing I noticed that there was a habit going around in the 1980s of people saying, I know I can't write a story until I get rid of my own stuff. And they were referring to their own stuff as if it were something ugly and horrible and you had to grow out of it. And I knew perfectly well that that own stuff is the treasure house. And that's where the fiction's made. And so I began to think, well, how do we get people to see their own lives as a treasure house? So I got interested in that idea.
I can't tell you how many writers I've met around the country who have told me that they teach from the passionate, accurate story. They love the passionate, accurate story. So you've hit on some home truths that writers feel keenly. That idea of the story behind the story, for instance, getting that second story out into the world. That's often the real one. And also not leaving your ethics and your social concerns at the door, or when you sit down to write, which is something you began talking about in a little book called Bad Government and Silly Literature, when you talked about the fact that people seem to think that only their sex lives are important when they sit down with their computers or their pens and pencils.
I think most of the writers' magazines on the popular magazine level tell people to go with the sex. And if you, even if you yourself have a very nice sex life, or a mild one, or just a civilized one in any way, better make it pretty brash and even sadistic stuff in order to make it sell. So people are told that sex and violence are what are important. And it takes a while to undo that.
And that's one of the pernicious things in this culture, that it's very hard for people to understand or get beyond, because when you're assaulted constantly by the media telling you, here's what's important, even if you don't feel that in your heart of hearts, you think, well, everybody else must feel it, and you kind of despair about that. And one of the things I feel is so important about Changing the Bully Who Rules the World, your book about literature and ethics, is allowing people to challenge what is the pervasive cultural value, having them recognize that there are better ways to be a human being and that we can learn them. And I'm fascinated about how you began to have those ideas. How did that first come to you?
I'm not sure I remember the exact moment when it did, but I've had some influences in my life of people who have taught me ways to start living out your ideals, not based on, instead of living out your actual life potential. In other words, instead of saying, well, where should we start with this? Well, we'll start where we are. And that was a great 1970s Grantsman's remark. You know, you start where the people are at, I believe was the expression.
Yes.
And I realized as soon as I ever heard that, leaving out the grammatical horror of it, that you don't start where they are. You start where their dream is, and then try to build them up to confidence to go back and fetch the dream again. So then I thought, well, that might be a good idea. And then I talked to a number of social workers and psychotherapists who said, oh yes, that's how we do it. We restore the words, get someone to say in their own words what their dream is. And they'll usually always say, well, or is that dumb? Or maybe that's just me, or some other unconfident remark. And then they'll say, no, no, not at all. And they keep having the person use the words of the dream until the dream is as real as the present outside of their eyes, what they're seeing before their eyes.
And in a way, by teaching an ethics course with others, you probably had the practical experience of seeing that in action. Am I right about that?
Well, it was nice. I was able to try some ideas that I brought out a little bit in the Passionate, Accurate Story and will bring out in the next book on writing nonfiction, which is that if someone says, I don't know what I think about life, but it's not good enough, and I know I think something, and I feel uneasy or anxious. Well, that's the United States in our time. And so then I've discovered that they could use a cheap psychotherapist trick, which is very easy, and it's wonderful, but nobody actually does it. And if they actually do it, it works. But people always say, oh yes, I do that. But if you say, when did you do it last? You find out they've never done it. And that is simply to make a list of everything you think is good in life and everything you think is bad. And that helps fiction writers, because then, after they've listed those terrible things, usually the terrible ones first, because they've been brought up on that, and then the good ones, you can say, well, now you can divvy up those terrible qualities among your characters, and you'll know because you feel each one of those things.
That's a great insight. Would you
borrowed from others, I may say.
Well, and one of the delights of Changing the Bully Who Rules the World is that people have the opportunity to see that they're not alone in their ideas about what's good and what's bad. And so to take ideas that have important social, ethical, and philosophical implications and make them available to readers and writers, I think is why this book is so important. I've told you before, but I consider this one of the most important books that Milkweed Editions has published. It's one of the reasons why there ought to be nonprofit presses. And so I'm hoping that you will read something from this book.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
We could easily educate 18-year-olds about working for bad organizations. Such education would bring them fresh pain because they have to get jobs somewhere, and few companies are pure. They would be forced into the humility you feel on deciding to take a salary from an organization that does evil up to such and such a level. As soon as one wakes up ethically, nothing again is ever clean-cut. What's more, what used simply to be a question of whether the work was interesting or not, whether it paid decently or not, now is complicated by whether it is all bad or middling bad or just a little bad. I will use myself as an example of a case in which actual naming of a wrong or a right would have sped me from mere fluttering of feelings into actually thinking it over. When I was 21, I worked a half year in the office of the Department of Nursing at the University of Minnesota. Once a week we smelled flesh burning. At any rate, we were told it was flesh burning, the flesh of dogs killed after surgical experimentation. A flurry went through me, a sensuous disturbance, not a thought, really. I was about as ethically conscious as someone who says, "Oh dear," or "That's hard to believe." My mind didn't suppose it should take the next step, connecting the stimulating thrill of dismay to some decision-making. Was it or was it not ethical for the University of Minnesota Medical School to use dogs to give student surgeons experience? Whatever moral flame I had was as flippy as a birthday candle before a child's breath. One reading of a passage by Brenda Euland on dogs being used by surgeons would have set me to work to think it through. I would have decided to think it through and decide where my sympathies lay, with the dogs or with future human patients of the surgeons, and then the issue would have lodged for the rest of my life in my imagination. But as it was, I visited the upper floor laboratory where some of those animals were kept, but I did not insist on seeing all of them, and I did not remember them.
I very much enjoyed this book, An Adolescent's Christmas, 1944, which has this beautiful cover photograph of you. Again, I'd appreciate it if you'd talk a little about what you have to say in An Adolescent's Christmas.
I'm very grateful, was very grateful for the chance to write that book, because I believe so much in what can happen in a formal education and what can happen during miserable times of your life. And people who have miserable times of their life, like most intellectuals, adolescents,
Yes.
and also have a formal education who like to read, if they have those things going on at the same time, it's as if they climbed up onto a magnificent horse of literature. They get to then, they can save themselves in some way. And you remember Denise Levertov's great remark about literature, about the divine animal that carries us through the world.
Yes.
And literature's like that. And they can do that and save themselves during adolescence. I went to a school which at the time I thought had to be a rare school because it was a boarding school. And now I realize that it could be if people would put out the funding for it and break every classroom in the United States down to 15 people, that everybody could be taught in that way, with one mentor for 15 young people. In any case, it was a tremendous exercise in freedom for me, because I came from a conventional city, as it was then. It's a more interesting city now, Duluth, and it wasn't the style then to love literature at age 14. Now there are all sorts of Duluthians doing all sorts of strange and wonderful things like loving literature.
That is hopeful. The fact that literature for children and for young people is, I think, much more valued. People recognize that it's important that to have children reading is one of the ways to save their lives. And certainly an idea that is terribly important to me. As I look back over all these books, these wonderful books in your career, one of the things I see is that you are always trying to figure out how people can save their lives, how people can take action and resist the bullies, resist the tyrants, resist the social forces that seem determined to grind one down. And there is a tremendous interest in the resilience of the individual spirit.
And some of it simply panic as well. I remember being very struck when we were living in a farmhouse at an evening at which the poet Louis Simpson and Robert Bly and James Wright and I and 2 or 3 other people were sitting around talking, and Louis Simpson was inveighing about the danger of Nazism. And the others were mostly smiling because that was Louis' thing. If he wants to be nervous about that, he can be. And everybody's looking at him tolerantly. And I realized that that was the first time I'd heard someone say out loud what I regard as the most terrifying and ongoing and unsolved problem that we have for human beings, is how to control that thing that loves to do genocides. It isn't that it accidentally does genocides, and nor is it just what Alice Miller said, which is that it's neurotic and therefore it does them. It's that it actually is something that mammals do.
Yes, and therefore something that other mammals need to take cognizance of and actively fight against.
Exactly, and when you hear someone say it out loud, that they are scared of Americans perhaps taking part in large bullying process like that, it makes a grin come to people's faces if they're thinking about it. And I was thinking about that grin, especially with respect to harsh truths that James Wright would say, because Because you feel safe, another human being has said it. So the evil that you thought you were being neurotic about is real. They said it, they saw it. So at least there are two of you on it. And therefore you grin. And you don't feel so crazy.
And I think it's there. For instance, in your new and selected stories, My Lord Bag of Rice, again, you give individuals the chance to talk about what they fear and also to do something about it, and not simply to lie down and accept it. And that's one of the things I love the most about your fiction. I mean, the stories are all wonderfully written, they're all wonderfully imagined, but they're heroic stories, and they're heroic stories about the fact that anybody can work his or her way toward that. And so, would you read something from My Lord Bag of Rice?
Sure. Jack and Eleanor sat in the dark staircase. She had underestimated the Episcopal priest, Jack, the best boarder in her boarding house. She had admired up till then only his ability to talk courteously. But now she whispered to him, "You saved Eunice's life." He said, "You don't even know what happened." Eleanor ignored that idiotic modesty and whispered, "What's more, she half saved yours too. When she rattled on and on all that history that you taught her and told it to the police, they obviously decided she was out of her head, and so they got up and went home. Of course," Eleanor added, feeling very sage, the way bystanders do when they second-guess the police, "they had been looking for that awful Leroy Beskey for a long time anyhow." "She didn't save my life either," Jack now said. Behind her door, they could hear Eleanor still talking to herself, reciting history very loud in her half-crazed way. She was moving away from Max Planck and introducing Marilyn French and Ruth Bleyer. Jack said from his stair, slightly above Eleanor's, "I want you to listen now. I didn't, repeat, didn't drop or throw a brick onto Leroy Beskey from that balcony. You know who goes around this house carrying cans of beef stew and books and bricks, too." Eleanor was still. "I don't believe you," she said. Jack said, "Leroy Beskey swiped her welfare check for over 2 years, and in the end he hid her and nearly starved her to death and dumped her in your basement when he couldn't think of anything else to do. So she was mad at him. He made a mistake. He was drunk when he came round here this morning, and for the fun of it, he tossed a brick through your window. He didn't figure Eunice right. She was on the balcony when he ambled by a few hours later. He shouted to her, 'Hi, little girl.' People on the other side of the house heard him. He probably didn't recognize her. He shouted, 'Hi, princess,' but she had a brick with her, because she and I were going to build the barbecue today. She was so mad she got off a fast, accurate shot. Anyhow," Jack finished up in a satisfied, brutal way, "she got him good."
I also want to ask you about something that many people have remarked upon, namely that when you give a, quote, reading, it's really a telling. Far more often you will tell a story, one of your written stories, or tell an essay, and the opportunity for you to actually be speaking to your audience.
Yes, I like it because I think it's a better offering than simply reading a manuscript. Almost all people who go to a literary reading are very good readers, and they can read faster by themselves in bed than they can listening, and they wouldn't have to pay anything nor park a car to come or put up with the ego of a speaker. Whereas if they get a story told to them, they can simply mosey through their thoughts while it's happening. Yeah.
And this speaks to the fact that all of us really love to be read to. I don't think anybody ever gets read to enough as a child, no matter how much it was done
That's right.
for them. And so when you read, when you speak to and tell a story to, it's such a first-hand experience. It feels so happy and so good. So bravo for you.
And you get to hear the things that children love in stories too, which is, meanwhile, even as they were speaking, some ominous other thing was happening.
Exactly.
Yes.
Back there, under the table, around the corner, and
Yes.
so forth. And that brings me to being very curious about your forthcoming book about writing nonfiction. I'd love to hear about it.
It's called Beyond the Writer's Workshop and New Ways of Learning Creative Nonfiction. And the idea in it is that it is a form of psychological abuse of adults and also financial abuse of adults for them to have to do peer review at all for any reason of each other's work. They're not trained to do it, they're not paid to do it, the teacher's paid to do it, therefore it's a financial fraud in a way, practiced by almost every university. And also it's cruel for children, because children shouldn't have to stand in judgment against each other, and they will, because they'll fall into it, because they haven't had training in not being bullies when this kind of thing happens. I mean, it's hard for them to be good. They want to be good, and they teach them how to be good, but it's hard. So this has a new idea instead, which is how to use a certain skill borrowed from therapists called empathic questioning, which is also discussed in Changing the Bully. And the idea is that we would, all of us learn to ask our own minds, the part that hasn't yet written a manuscript. We have a little draft down here, but we haven't written it yet. Oh yes, mind. And what else have you got to say? As though their mind were a Cheshire cat, now showing its face, now not. And the mind would feel the politeness and the courteous of it and bring up its deepermost thoughts.
So, it's a lovely idea.
And it's better than having other people come into the scene at that point.
And it makes great sense, and it reminds me of the fact that back in 1981, you and I were teaching up in Bemidji at a Midwest Writers Workshop, and I remember that you had the longest hours with your students, that long after the rest of us were finished.
You mean office hours?
Office hours, with your students.
Oh.
And I thought, here is a great teacher. And so the great teacher is finding other ways for students to learn and not to be bullied. So I know I will be grateful to you for that, as I am grateful to you for all of these books that I've had the joy of reading.
I'm grateful, of course, to you, as I've said many times. Changing the Bully was rewritten 4 times, thanks to you, and it's a good thing it was, too.
Well, I'm thrilled to be part of that book. Thank you, Carol. And thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Carol Bly talking about her work on Northern Lights.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.